Hello everyone and welcome to the third installment in the Old and Word book series of book reviews. Um, this is a retake of the Gormenghast review. It's one of my favourite books of all time. I wanted to do it justice. I ended up rambling for about an hour and it's just far too much to edit, really. I went through almost every single character and described them. Probably not going to do that in this review. So, I'd like to first direct your attention to the painting in the background. It's a painting by Alan Lee, one of my favourite artists of all time, one of my favourite people of all time, and it's fitting because this is one of my favourite books of all time. I should clarify first actually that I'm going to omit the third book in the trilogy for various reasons. I will probably talk about those at the end, those issues at the end. But I will consider it a duology, and I probably just refer to it as the book because I'm doing this review as a whole, trying to consider Gormenghast, Titus Groan, and Gormenghast, the first two books, as a whole. So, in the bottom left-hand corner, we see a statue of Sepulchrave, or at least I like to think it's Sepulchrave. It's one of the Earls of Gormenghast. We have some white cats there. Signifying Countess Gertrude. We have the lady in red there is Fuchsia Groan. Next to her, Nanny Slag, the caretaker of Titus Groan. And the man with the very long legs, spindly legs, is Flay, the butler. The decrepit man in the foreground nearest to us is Barkentine, the keeper of the Groan lore. And the little man there, in the background on the stairs, with the pallid face and the high forehead, is Steerpike. We will come to all these characters. I won't probably go into as much depth as I did before. But the book is, for me, a book of characters. What is the book about, though? What is Titus Groan and Gormenghast about? It's essentially, I have written a sentence down here. It's essentially a story about a young boy called Titus Groan, who grows up to inherit a meaningless title to perform meaningless traditions for no reason. I think that's the best way I can describe it, and I've tried to emulate some of the acerbic sort of wit and the sardonic nature of the book, of the two books. So it's a book that deals with a cast of characters, and it's actually one of the first fantasy of manners books, which is essentially a literary term to describe a book that has dealings with family relations and social hierarchies and some political intrigue. I've not read too much of those, but as far as I'm aware, as far as I understand, this is one of the very first fantasy of manners books. And the first two books actually, or the first three books, came out in the 40s and 50s. Titus Groan came out in 1946, Gormenghast came out in 1950, and Titus Alone came out in 1959. Interestingly, they're actually, for some reason, they're compared to The Lord of the Rings. I think that's just because the Lord of the Rings trilogy came out at the same time as this trilogy, roughly, in the 50s, mid-50s. But, a little bit on Mervyn Peake. Mervyn Peake was an illustrator that grew up in China. And the fact that he's an illustrator is very important because, as we will see soon enough, the book it feels like an illustrator's work. If you Google image Mervyn Peake illustrations, you'll see that he was quite a competent and quite characterful illustrator, and it really also shows in the writing as well. It's very evocative imagery. If the King of Elfland's Daughter is painterly, this is painterly in a different sense. It's more dark and gothic. It deals with other types of imagery, and we'll see some of that imagery later on. But Mervyn Peake, he grew up in China, and I believe he grew up in a totalitarian regime, and I believe that coloured some of the themes of the Gormenghast books. So Titus Groan, he grows up in this city-like castle, where there are a bunch of traditions that seem to be completely meaningless. They'll, for example, at a very specific time, they'll just perform these deeds which seem really quite absurd. There's almost like a Camus-esque absurdity to it, where it's just funny that these characters, handful of characters, everything they do, it's made more funny because outside of the castle, outside the city-like castle, the sprawling castle, nothing they do really matters. So it's just even funnier that the Lord Sepulchreve, the 76th Earl of Groan, will just get up and walk a certain way, or say a certain line that he has to say at a certain specific time period. Maybe it's a season, or they'll look at the clock and they'll say, "Oh, it's time to do this," and it's quite funny. It's also quite melancholy and depressing as well, though, which there's definitely elements to that. And it's actually one of my favourite parts of the book series. It blends humour with pathos and melancholy and violence, but also humour and compassion as well. So this book, it's not well known, sadly. It's considered, it's very highly reputed for those that know it and who love the books, obviously. Harold Bloom himself, the writer of the Western canon, described this one as one of his best fantasies of all time. You'll see charts, for example, of people saying like this book should be on par with the Iliad, or maybe not the Iliad, but famous books like War and Peace and Stranger. Virginia Woolf, for example, any sort of classic author or book that you might think of. Mervyn Peake is definitely, he's a literary fantasy writer. Was a literary fantasy writer. So that's just a very quick summary of where we are with Gormenghast. But I'd like to dwell on the characters, because as I say, it's a novel of characters. It's a series of novels that deals with the relations of Steerpike and Flay and people like Swelter and Fuchsia and Titus. First, I'd just like to summarise very quickly the structure of the books. Titus Groan, the first book, deals with other characters than Titus Groan, because Titus Groan is a child at the very start of the story. He's soon to come into the inheritance of Gormenghast, to take over from Lord Sepulchreve, or Earl Sepulchreve of House Groan. It's essentially deals with other characters, for example, the rise of Steerpike, who begins his life in the novels as a kitchen boy and grows up to be, I won't spoil it, but grows up to take an advisor role and becomes essential to the plot. Book 2, actually entitled Gormenghast, deals with Titus growing up. I believe at the end of the book, he's either 17, so let's just say he comes into his own. He has to deal with the problem of Steerpike. Steerpike has, so with the rise of Steerpike comes the rise of Titus Groan and his eventual assumption of the title of the 77th Earl of Gormenghast. And so, as far as the characters go, and I would like to dwell on the characters, because unlike the other two books, this really, for me, this Gormenghast it's about the cast, it's about the personalities, it's about the almost caricature-like nature of people like Prune Squalor and Rock Cod, all these evocative names and images that are conjured up when you think of this host of. It's almost like a pantomime to me. It's an absurdist sort of. It's like a farce. I think it is really. It's like a farce. It's a dark, comedic farce. It's the best way I can describe it. So we have Titus, who is soon to be the 77th Earl. He's born into stagnation. He's blinded by the different traditions that constantly are occurring in Gormenghast, in the Castle of Gormenghast. He eventually becomes someone that is pulled in two different directions. He's highly independent, but he also has his pride in his heritage. Um, Unlike, for example, Lord Sepulchrave, which is who is one of my favorite characters in fiction. Lord Sepulchrave is a melancholy, broken down Earl of melancholy, broken down Earl of Gormenghast. He's in an unfortunate position. Gormenghast has broken him down. The traditions have sundered himself from himself, I think, if that makes any sense. He loves withdrawing into his books. Actually, he has a favoured library that he considers his retreat, out in this, I believe it's a cedar forest or a pine forest out of Gormenghast, outside of Gormenghast. He retreats there, dwells on the literature of the poets and the philosophers. His character actually inspired a lot of my work. Then we have Countess Gertrude. Countess Gertrude wasn't a standout for me, but she shows some interesting leadership qualities by the end of the book. She starts off as an aloof character. She's this statuesque, it's like dark red hair. She's quite a large woman. I feel like she's one of those characters that could have been in like a Lewis Carroll novel, for example, the Alice in Wonderland. She's this large character with red hair, and she has the white cats, as you see in the background there. Those white cats belong to Countess Gertrude. She has birds that she continually talks to and that constantly visit her room. She stays in her room all the time. She doesn't really care about anything else other than tending to her birds and cats. This army of cats that follows her around. Definitely an evocative character, but not really a standout for me. Next is Fuchsia, the sister of Titus, an artistic soul, sort of an she has some contempt for the Groan lore, let's say, the Groan history and the traditions. She has a relationship, like a budding relationship with Steerpike, which allows Steerpike to infiltrate the ranks of the Groan household. We have people like Cora and Clarice. They're two sisters that constantly finish their own sentences, like long-necked, highly vain, highly strung, sort of high-maintenance sisters that are shunned by the Gormenghast household. They're just kept away, and we don't speak of Cora and Clarice. And they try to. Steerpike has some dealings with them, so another way for Steerpike to infiltrate and become more important to the way that the government of Gormenghast. There are characters like Flay, the butler, who has quite admirable loyalty to Sepulchrave, and also he's quite compassionate when it comes to his dealings with Fuchsia and Titus. He feels for them. He feels what they're going through. The two young children of Sepulchrave and Countess Gertrude. We have people like Prunescholar. Actually, Prunescholar is one of my favourite characters in fiction. Highly humorous. I don't read much in terms of comedic fiction, but Prunescholar is almost everything he says is hilarious. Genuinely quite hilarious. I think I just sort of connected with the way he sort of operates. He's too intelligent for his own good. He speaks way too fast. He constantly adds these little, I'm not quite sure what the word is, all these different clauses that make his dialogue quite funny. He'll just blunder through a sentence. I'll try and emulate how he speaks later on in an excerpt. We have people like Sourdust and Barkentine. Barkentine is in the painting there, with the walking cane, the crutch. He is the son of Sourdust. So you might have noticed, first of all, actually, you might have noticed the names: Sepulchrave, Sourdust, Flay, Steerpike. I think one of the best parts of the book is that it actually the names just are so evocative and characterful. For example, sepulchre. Steerpike evokes a harsh nature. He's steering through his way up to the highest rank in Gormenghast society. Flay, the hard-natured Flay. Fuchsia, the sort of painterly soul. So you see where I'm going with this. Definitely works with Peake's illustrator background, I think. But Barkentine, back to Barkentine. He is the son of Sourdust. He's one of the upholders of the Groan lore, a very misanthropic character, very hard character. Pretty much hates everyone, hates everything apart from the Groan lore. Sourdust was a little bit more compassionate, but yes. So when it comes to those two, Sourdust and Barkentine, father and son, I almost always think of dust and parchment and bone, the seer laws of Gormenghast. Really quite interesting characters and how they uphold the Groan lore. We have people like Swelter. Swelter is actually one of my favourite characters at the start. He's so characterful. He's a rotund, corpuscular chef. We first meet him in this kitchen scene where Steerpike is just a young kitchen boy, and it's really evocative of, or representative of, the way that Peake writes characters. This huge, rotund chef who gathers his children around him, the trainees of the kitchen in this sprawling medieval castle, and everything he says is slurred in the beginning. He's drinking. He puts his large hand on a sweaty pillar. It's just, it's incredible. The way he writes really is just so full of imagery. We have all these other characters as well, such as Belgrove, Cada as well. I won't get into those too much, but suffice it to say, the cast of characters in Gormenghast is just phenomenal. And if we take Gormenghast itself, the castle, it's almost a living character. It really is. I actually read a comment recently that there's a part where Flay, the butler, he actually maps out certain parts of Gormenghast, and it seems to grow when he's mapping it out. The map itself, the parchment, I believe it, if I remember correctly, just sprawled over the table. The city is so large. Actually, someone also said that it feels like you could be an explorer really and map out new territory. It almost has its own ecology where certain parts are ruined and just so sprawling, and nature will just take over. Actually, you can see there in the painting there are some vines and moss that's growing on pillars and all the archways. So the character of Gormenghast really it has its own sort of personality to it. So in terms of what exists outside of Gormenghast, there is the mud dwellers, or the bright carvers, and unfortunately for me, I didn't quite connect with that society. I think it was just a little bit too strange. It seemed too disconnected from Gormenghast. Perhaps that's what Peake was trying to do. This stagnant society, this mantle of dust over Gormenghast and its traditions. And I felt like for the bright carvers, the mud dwellers in these huts of mud, they had I suppose it's good because they had a sense of a flame within them, a sort of passion. There's, for example, a character of Cada who is actually taken into Gormenghast, who was of the bright carvers, the mud dwellers. I use those two terms interchangeably. Who's taken in to Gormenghast and who becomes Titus's wet nurse, actually. And she has dealings with two mud dwellers called Brygon and Rantel, who they end up in a moonlit fight scene, and they feel more alive, I suppose. So I guess that's a good contrast between Gormenghast Castle and the mud dwellers. But I'll read a paragraph concerning these people, so I can show you how they operate and what their society is like. Also known as the Mud Dwellers, or the Outer Dwellers, the Bright Carvers live directly outside the castle walls, crammed closely together in hovels of mud and straw. Their lives are hard and monotonous, and they live solely on yarrow root, a kind of tree growing on in Gormenghast Forest, and crusts of bread lowered down from the castle walls each morning. Their sole obsession is the carving of beautiful wooden sculptures brightly painted, which they present to the Groans on a particular day each year. Only 3 of these carvings were chosen by the Earl of Gormenghast to be kept, and the rest are burnt. So they have their own traditions, they have their own lore. So I guess it's an interesting contrast in the difference, analysing the difference between the two. But that side of the plot didn't particularly interest me as much as it did the cast of characters in Gormenghast. So as far as the pros and cons go, it's one of the most atmospheric and imaginative books that I can remember. I read this book perhaps August or October of last year, 2019, and I think it just, as soon as I read some of the passages, as I said, this must be some of the best literature that I've ever read. The characters are unbelievably strong and evocative. Not sure if this makes sense, but Steerpike could only be Steerpike, Barkentine could only be Barkentine, Sepulchrave could only be Sepulchrave. I can't really think of any other characters in any other books that are so well-rounded and whole as the characters in Gormenghast. One of the things I like as well is a sense of rule-breaking in Gormenghast. Peake was a rule-breaker in terms of literature. There's a whole section in book 1, maybe book 2 actually, but there's a whole section called the Reveries. It's essentially just a series of thoughts from each character as they are sitting at a banquet, at a dinner. It's one of my favourite parts of any book, really. It's so... Again, everything revolves around the characters in Gormenghast. So we'll have, for example, the Reveries of Sepulchrave, where it'll be in his voice, in his tongue, in his language, in his thoughts. So it'll be melancholy and very steady and depressed, whereas Prune Squalor will have a very upbeat and witty and acerbic and intelligent sort of voice. And there'll be things like run-on sentences, there'll be no syntax and no grammar as well. Cora and Clarice, the sisters of Sepulchrave, will say the exact same things in their revelries. They'll say the exact same thoughts identically. Steerpike will probably be, if he was at the dinner, can't quite remember, he'll be plotting away. So you see where I'm going with this. Very distinct characters. As far as the cons go, I think the book can drag it sometimes. There are poetic descriptions, lyrical descriptions. For example, Peake likes to dwell on imagery that just, it's too extended, I think. For example, there might be Titus looking into a marble at school, where it's just the reflections of colours and a series of run-on images that this marble conjures up in Titus' mind. There'll be a leaf falling from a forest tree, which might just run on for several long paragraphs, which is good in a sense, but it's not. Might be quite dry for some. I found it like a love-hate relationship with it, really. And I don't really have another con is that I don't have too much good to say about the outside of Gormenghast. I appreciate the contrast between the Bright Carvers and the Mud Dwellers to Gormenghast, the castle and its inhabitants, but I wasn't much of a fan of that, really. And so, let us begin with the excerpts. So please sit back and relax and enjoy the writing of Mervyn Peake. The many duties which to another might have become irksome and appeared fatuous were to his lordship a relief and a relative escape from himself. He knew that he was past all hope a victim of chronic melancholia, and were he to have had each day to himself, he would have had to resort constantly to those drugs that were even now undermining his constitution. This evening, as he sat silently in the velvet-backed chair, his mind turned to many subjects like a black craft, that though it steers through many waters has always beneath it a deathly image reflected among the waves. Philosophers in the poetry of death, the meaning of the stars and the nature of those dreams that haunted him, when in those chloral hours before the dawn, the laudanum built for him within his skull a tallow-coloured world of ghastly beauty. This is one of my favourite passages in all the fiction. The gift of the bright blood, of blood that laughs when the tenants mutter weep, of blood that mourns when the seer laws croak rejoice, O little revolution in great shades. I think that really sums up Titus's role, actually, or anyone's defiant role against stagnation and tradition. O little revolution in great shades. What can one man do against such stifling tradition? Who are the characters, and what has he learned of them, and of his home, since that far day when he was born to the Countess of Groan, in a room alive with birds? He has learned an alphabet of ark and ale, the language of dim stairs and moth-hung rafters. Great halls are his playgrounds, his fields are quadrangles, his trees are pillars, and he has learned that there are always eyes that watch, feet that follow, and hands to hold him when he struggles, to lift him when he falls. Upon his feet again he stares unsmiling. Tall figures bow, some in jewellery, some in rags, the characters, the quick and the dead, the shapes, the voices that throng his mind, for there are days when the living have no substance and the dead are active. Who are these dead, these victims of violence who no longer influence the tenor of Gormenghast save by a deathless repercussion? For ripples are still widening in dark rings, and a movement runs over the goose-flesh waters, though the drowned stones lie still. An excerpt of Prune Squalor. I will try to emulate as best I can. Cedars, said Prune Squalor, squinting at the trees before him with his head tilted and his eyes half closed, are excellent trees, very, very excellent. I positively enjoy cedars. But do cedars positively enjoy me? Ha! Do they, my dear flea, do they? Or is this rather above you, my man, is my philosophy a trifle above you? For if I enjoy cedar, but cedar does not, enjoy me, then surely I am at once in a position of compromise, being, as it were, ignored by the vegetable world, which would think, marks you, my dear fellow, would think twice about ignoring a cart full of mulch. Another funny passage from Prune Squalor. We might say, bring the baby to the door. What does Prune Squalor say? Convey his minute lordship to the door, that for some reason that is too subtle for me to appreciate remains shut. Why, in the name of ventilation, I don't know, but it does, it remains shut. They sprawled over the sloping earth, each one halfway over its neighbour, until, held back by the castle ramparts, the innermost of these hovels laid hold on the great walls, clamping themselves thereto like limpets to a rock. These dwellings, by ancient law, were granted this chill intimacy with the stronghold that loomed above them. Over their irregular roofs would fall throughout the seasons the shadows of time-eaten buttresses, of broken flints and lofty towers, and most enormous of all, the shadow of the Tower of Flints. This tower, patched unevenly with black ivy, arose like a mutilated finger from among the fists of knuckled masonry, and pointed blasphemously at heaven. At night, the owls made of it an echoing throat. By day, it stood voiceless and cast its long shadow. The while, beneath the downpour and the sunbeams, the castle hollow as a tongueless bell, its corroded shell dripping or gleaming with the ephemeral weather, arose in immemorial defiance of the changing airs and skies. These were but films of altering light and hue, sunbeam shifting into moonbeam, the wafted leaf into the wafted snow, the musk into a tooth of icicle. These but the transient changes on its skin, each hour a pulse the more, a shade the less, a lizard basking and a robin frozen. Book 3, very briefly, Titus Alone, is one of my least favourite books. Not just because it ruined Gormenghast, the two books that I consider to be the coherent Gormenghast. It's just very poorly written, and not to disparage Peake at all. Actually, Peake succumbed to an illness. I believe it was dementia. At the last quarter of his life, I believe. Just very briefly, the synopsis would be that Titus leaves Gormenghast and enters a strange sci-fi city where he meets people like Muzzlehatch, a zookeeper who drives a living car. He escapes from glass orbs that spy on him. He escapes from helicopters. He watches through a skylight obnoxious partygoers. So really, the book has no real connection to Gormenghast. I'm not sure why it's published. I don't think... I'm of a mind to say skip it if you would like to read the Gormenghast Trilogy, because it leaves a bad taste in the mouth, really. For me it did. I read it simply to honour Gormenghast, but if you're interested in seeing how the full sort of trilogy progresses, read it. But don't expect anything great. Unfortunately, it's a bit too disjointed. We have characters that appear and disappear, that die and come out of nowhere and just leave for no reason. People like the Black Rose and this underground society that collects books, and there are people like Cheetah, for example, this strange, unlikable character that has a sort of romantic relationship with Titus. Unfortunately, not a great book. It's quite a short book, but it's actually one of my least favourite works of fiction. Titus Groan and Gormenghast are two of my favourite books of all time. I hope you enjoyed the review, and hope you get into the books, and hope you enjoy them as much as I did. So until next time, until the next review, thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.